He pressed one button, and the room went completely silent. 219 delegations sat under the high dome of the Galactic Accord's grand chamber, and not one of them made a sound. Above the podium, the display filled with light. Not weapons schematics, not casualty charts. Crayon. Blue-green planets with rings of light around them. Stick figures holding hands under yellow suns drawn too big for the sky. 431 children had drawn them. 431 of them filled the wall now, all at once. The man at the podium didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His coat was plain grey, no medals, no ribbons, and his hands had stopped shaking 3 days ago. He waited until the silence had a shape of its own. Even the Velkath delegation's mandibles had gone still. The chamber's translation drones, usually humming low, had gone quiet too, as if they didn't trust themselves to interrupt. Then he began to read. Liam, age 7, loved drawing starships. In the third row, a Velkath elder's optical clusters dimmed, just slightly. The closest thing his kind had to flinching. Priya, age 5, afraid of the dark. The names kept coming. No one moved to stop him. No one dared. This was the 72nd hour. To understand how 91 warships came to sit outside a Dominion capital without firing a shot, how one grieving man brought an empire's ceremonial guard to its knees with construction paper, you have to go back. Back to a ship that should never have been a target. You'll want to know what happened in between. I promise you, it's worse than you're picturing and better than you'd hope. 72 hours before, the ship was called the Ardent Hope, and it smelled like recycled air and warm bread from the mess deck 3 levels down. Captain Mara Sololis had read the same navigation log 4 times that morning, and something about it still itched at the back of her skull. She wasn't sure what. That was the problem. The Ardent Hope carried 431 children in cryo-nursery pods, sons and daughters of the Meridian Colony Project, headed 6 days out to Helix Station and the New World waiting past it. No weapons. No armor plating beyond the hull's minimum safety rating. A civilian transport, filed and stamped and paid for 3 times over in corridor tax to a Dominion that liked its paperwork more than its neighbors. Sololis had filed the transit permit herself, paid the toll in person at Velkathari Customs, watched the attaché stamp it with 4 separate seals, exchanged the ceremonial greeting required at every border crossing since the last treaty. Everything by the book, everything correct. Down on deck 3, in the shelter compartment nobody ever expected to use, the walls were covered in drawings. Crayon and marker on bare metal panels. A blue-green planet with a ring of light around it. Stick figures. Smiling suns. A girl named Priya had drawn hers in purple because she said blue was for the ocean and purple was for space, and space should get its own color. Lieutenant David Marsh monitored the diplomatic frequencies out of habit more than concern. 3 Velkath escort vessels had shadowed them since the corridor's edge, standard practice, nothing unusual. He logged it. He didn't flag it. At 4:13 hours, Sololis's console lit with 3 new contacts. Spineclaw-class destroyers, close enough that their running lights should have shown on visual long before now. They're not hailing, Marsh said. Try all channels, Sololis said. Diplomatic, emergency, open broadcast, all of them. He tried. Nothing came back. Not silence exactly. Worse than silence. The kind of quiet a transmitter makes when someone on the other end is listening and choosing not to answer. Sololis stood. The itch at the back of her skull had a name now. Deck 3, she said. Wake the shelter crew, now. She didn't know yet that the destroyers weren't aiming for the shelter. She didn't know they'd studied the Ardent Hope schematics for 11 days before this one. She didn't know the first shots wouldn't touch the hull at all. She only knew the itch had turned into something with teeth, and that 431 children were still asleep 3 decks below her, dreaming in cryo, purple planets pinned to the walls around them. The first shots didn't touch the hull. They took out the communications array in a single, precise burst, then the port thrusters, then the emergency beacon housing, 3 strikes inside 4 seconds, close enough together that Sololys felt them as one long shudder through the deck plates. No warning shot, no demand, just the quiet, surgical removal of every way the Ardent Hope had to call for help. "Comms are down," Marsh said. His voice had gone flat, the way voices do when panic hasn't caught up to the news yet. "Beacons down. We can't." "Emergency subspace burst," Sololys said. "Manual crank relay aft junction. Go." He went. She stayed at the console, watching 3 destroyers close the distance with the unhurried patience of something that had already decided how this would end. Down on Deck 3, the shelter crew had the children moving, cryopods on wheeled frames, small blankets tucked around small shoulders, some of them stirring awake into a world that was already ending around them. A boy named Tomas, 6 years old, asked why they were moving so fast. Nobody answered him. Nobody had an answer that wouldn't be a lie. Marsh reached the aft junction and cranked the manual relay by hand, the old low-tech kind that didn't need main power, the kind built for exactly this. He kept his thumb on the burst key and spoke into it, and somewhere out past the Velkathari corridor, a message began crawling through subspace at the maddening, stubborn pace of the oldest, ugliest, most reliable transmitter in the fleet. "Ardent Hope to any vessel. We are under attack. 431 children aboard." He sent it 3 times before the array finally died for good. It took the Velkath 47 minutes to finish. That number would be repeated so many times in the days that followed that people would stop hearing it as a number at all. 47 minutes. Long enough to know it was happening. Long enough for the crew to get every pod they could into the reinforced shelter compartment, the one with the drawings on the walls, purple planets and yellow suns watching children who were too young to understand what the sounds outside meant. Not long enough to save any of them. When it was finished, the Velkath destroyers didn't linger. They didn't board. They didn't confirm the kill in any way a human officer would recognize. They simply turned together and folded back into the dark the way they'd come. Councilwoman Preth Veldara received the report 9 minutes later, forwarded through a chain of relays that existed mostly on paper, the kind of paperwork that made things deniable later. She read it once at her desk, in an office with a window that looked out over the Velkath capital's terraced gardens. Her manipulators didn't shake. She typed a single line and sent it to High Command, encrypted, routine-flagged, the digital equivalent of a shrug. "Confirmed. The package has been delivered." She went back to her tea before it went cold. The burst reached Fleet Admiral Jonas Cale aboard the UHNS Sovereign Wrath at 6:11 hours. Ensign Reyes printed it on physical paper. The old habit Fleet Command still kept for anything flagged Priority 1, and carried it to the Admiral's ready room with hands that wouldn't quite stay still. Cale read it once, then again, slower, as if the second reading might change the words. He didn't look up right away. On the wall behind his desk, pinned in a neat row, were 7 crayon drawings his own children had made him over the years. Houses with too many windows, a dog with 6 legs, a sun that took up half the page. He kept every one of them close enough to see from his chair. He read every casualty name aloud when the lists came in. It was a habit from Denger's mouth, 32 years back, the battle that had taken half his squadron and left him the only one who came home to explain it. He'd promised himself back then that he would never let a name become a number. Not once, not ever. This time there would be 431 of them. He stood in silence for 12 full seconds. Reyes counted them without meaning to, the way you count the space after a door closes and doesn't open again. Then Cale set the paper down flat on his desk, smoothed the corner with 2 fingers and said, "Full battle readiness, all decks." Rear Admiral Una Park reached the ready room in 90 seconds flat, already pulling up deployment lists on her data slate before she'd fully cleared the doorway. "Sir, Sololys' ship is gone," Cale said. "All 431. I want every available hull ready to move inside the hour." Park didn't ask which ship. She didn't need the name twice. Cale sent 3 messages before he sent anything to the fleet. one to Helix Station, requesting full logistics support, one to the human embassy inside Velkath space, a warning wrapped in diplomatic language thin enough to see through, one to the Earth Security Council, 4 lines long, no embellishment. President Ala Voss answered inside 11 minutes. You have everything you need. Go. 3 words shorter than the questions people would ask about it for years afterward. Cale read it twice, the same way he'd read the casualty report, and something in his shoulders settled, the particular stillness of a man who has stopped waiting for permission he already has. What followed in the next 18 hours was something military historians would later describe with a single haunting phrase: the quiet mobilization. No declarations blasted across every channel. No ultimatums broadcast to Velkath space. Just ships. 67 of them confirmed within the first 6 hours, moving out from 3 separate staging points with running lights dimmed to the legal minimum. Then 79. Then, by hour 14, 91 warships and 3 full carrier groups, gathering at the edge of the Velkathari corridor with the unhurried, deliberate patience of something that had already decided how this would end. Behind them, trailing at a distance that made no tactical sense until you understood what it meant, came the civilian colonization convoy. Families, supply haulers, terraform seed ships. The humans weren't just coming to destroy, they were coming to stay. Lieutenant Commander Faye Oduya's recovery team reached the wreck of the Ardent Hope 11 hours after the attack, when the hull had gone cold and the emergency lighting had failed to a dim, bloodless red. She'd requested the assignment herself. Her sister's daughter, 7 years old, had been 3 decks down in a cryopod with a purple planet drawn on the wall beside it. The shelter compartment was the last space they entered. The walls were covered in drawings. Crayon and marker on bare metal panels, a blue-green planet with a ring of light around it, stick figures holding hands, smiling suns too big for the sky they were drawn into. Oduya stood in the doorway for a long moment before she made herself walk in. She photographed every drawing, all of them. Then she compiled the images into a single file and sent it to Fleet Admiral Cale with 1 line attached. So you don't forget what you're doing this for. Cale opened the file standing at his command window, 91 warships arrayed in silence below him, and for the first time since he'd read the casualty report, his hands were not steady. High Commander Keth Varen's left manipulator began rotating before the message had even finished decoding. He stood in the strategy dome of the Velkath flagship Cinder Wrought, watching a tactical display that had, in the space of 14 hours, become something he no longer recognized. 67 human hulls, then 79. Now, according to the officer stammering beside him, 91 confirmed warships and 3 carrier groups holding position at the edge of the Velkathari corridor without so much as a single hail sent ahead of them. They haven't demanded anything, the officer said. No ultimatum, no declaration of hostilities, they're just there. Varen's mandibles clicked twice sharp. Humans negotiate, every species negotiates, find me the demand. There wasn't one. That was the part his 847 tactical victories had never prepared him for. An enemy fleet that didn't want anything from him yet. He had faced war fleets before, posturing fleets, fleets sent to extract concessions with the threat of violence held just out of reach like a blade you were meant to see. This was different. This one wasn't posturing. It wasn't waiting for him to blink first. It was simply arriving, the way weather arrives, indifferent to whether he was ready. Councilwoman Preth Veldara arrived at the strategy dome 11 minutes later, summoned from her garden office, tea still unfinished on her desk back home. She found Varen standing perfectly still at the display, which for a Velkath of his rank and temperament was its own kind of alarm. High Commander, she kept her voice level. The mobilization is contained to the corridor. It has not crossed into sovereign space. Yet. The strike was authorized and executed within acceptable parameters. She said it the way she'd say a number on a supply manifest. There is no formal grievance mechanism that applies to a civilian transit vessel of unregistered military value. Varen turned to look at her, all three optical clusters at once, and for the first time in the 11 years she'd known him, she saw something behind them that wasn't calculation. 431, he said. You wrote it down as a package. She didn't answer that. 3 days after the attack, the Galactic Accord's emergency session was convened on Helix Station, in the grand chamber that had stood, unaltered, for 200 years. 219 delegations filled the tiered seating, representatives from species whose names took longer to pronounce than most treaties took to negotiate. The Velkath delegation sat in the third row, Preth Veldara among them, her manipulators folded still in her lap. Fleet Admiral Jonas Kale entered without an honor guard. He wore the same plain grey coat he'd worn on the Sovereign Wrath, no medals, no ribbons pinned above his heart. Lieutenant Commander Faye Oduya walked half a step behind him, carrying a single data slate against her chest like something that might break. She had not slept in 2 days. Her stress-del had gotten worse, fingertips pressing against every surface she passed without quite touching it, the doorframe, the podium's edge, the back of an empty chair, as though she were checking the world was still solid enough to hold what she was about to show it. Before they entered, in the corridor outside the chamber doors, Kale stopped and adjusted his collar. Just once, a small unconscious motion, the kind a man makes 100 times a day without noticing he's doing it. Oduya watched him do it and understood, in a way she couldn't have explained, that it was the last ordinary thing either of them would do for a long while. "Sir," she said, "they're ready for you." He nodded once, didn't say anything back. They went in together. The Accord's presiding officer, a slow-spoken Thessaline elder named Save Amarant, called the session to order with the customary opening words, the ones that had opened every session for 2 centuries, and Kale barely heard them. He was watching the third row, watching Preth Veldara sit very still, the way prey sits still when it has convinced itself that stillness is the same thing as safety. He had come prepared to make a case. Somewhere between the Sovereign Wrath and Helix Station, he had stopped believing a case was what this required. At the edge of the chamber, unnoticed by most of the gathered delegations, a message reached the Myrai observation seat. The raised platform kept empty at every Accord session because no one expected it to be filled. The Myrai rarely attended. They rarely spoke at all. Their civilization predated the Accord itself by a span of time most species found difficult to hold in their heads, and their silence had become, over 2 centuries, a kind of institutional furniture, a chair no one expected anyone to sit in. Today, the chair was not empty. An elder had come. Slow-moving, resonant-voiced, ancient in a way that made even the Thessaline elder look young, the Myrai representative settled into the observation seat without a word to anyone, and simply waited, the way something waits that has already decided what it thinks and is only confirming whether the galaxy will earn the hearing of it. No one in the chamber understood yet what that meant. Kale didn't see it. Varen, watching a secure feed of the session from the Cinder Wrought, did, and his manipulator stopped rotating entirely, gone still in a way that unsettled him more than the motion ever had. The Myrai hadn't formally addressed an Accord session in 60 years. Whatever tipped them into that seat today, it hadn't been the mobilization. It hadn't been the warships. Varen understood, with a cold certainty that settled into his carapace like frost, that it had been something smaller and worse than either. Something the humans hadn't shown anyone yet. Save Amarant called the human delegation forward. Kale stepped up to the podium, Oduya at his side, the data slate still pressed against her chest. He set his palms flat on the podium's edge and looked out at the 219 delegations arrayed in front of him, and for a moment he said nothing at all. He let the silence sit. He had learned, over 32 years, that silence was the one language every species in this chamber understood the same way. 3 days ago, he said, a ship called the Ardent Hope left the Velkathari corridor, carrying 431 children to a colony they will never see. A ripple went through the tiered seats, Not loud, more a shift of posture, dozens of species leaning fractionally forward at once. I'm not here to ask this chamber for a resolution, Kale said. I'm not here to file a grievance or request sanctions or petition for review under whatever article covers the murder of children who never carried a weapon in their lives. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I'm here to show you what was on that ship, and then I'm going to read you every name. He reached for the slate in Oduya's hands. She passed it to him without a word, her fingers brushing his for just a moment, the way you hand someone something you both know they can't put down again once they've picked it up. Preth Veldara, 3 rows back, watched Kale's thumb hover over the display control, and for the first time since she'd typed confirmed, the package has been delivered and gone back to her tea. Something in her chest went very cold. Behind Kale, unseen by anyone in the chamber, a runner from Helix Station's communications relay slipped through a side door and pressed a folded slip of paper into an aide's hand. The aide read it once, went pale, and did not interrupt. The message would not reach Kale for another 6 minutes. It contained a number that had nothing to do with the drawings, or the names, or the 431 children waiting to be spoken aloud. It was a border report. 3 more Velkath systems, far past the Velkathari corridor, had gone quiet in the last hour. Not attacked, not invaded. Simply closed. Trade routes shuttered, civilian traffic grounded, as if something on the other side already knew what was coming and had decided that hiding was the only strategy left. Kale's thumb rested on the display control. He hadn't pressed it yet. He pressed it. The wall behind him filled with light, and for 1 full second nothing in the chamber moved at all. Then the shape of what was there resolved, and 219 delegations understood, all at once, what they were looking at. Not weapons, not casualty figures rendered in cold administrative red. 431 blue-green planets, drawn in crayon, each one circled by its own ring of light, no 2 quite the same shade of blue. The silence that followed had weight. It pressed down on the tiered seating the way real gravity does. In the 3rd row, Preth Veldara sat with her manipulators locked together in her lap, and she did not look away, because looking away now, in front of everyone, would have been its own confession. 60 seconds passed. No one spoke. No one in that chamber, across 200 years of recorded sessions, could remember the room ever holding still that long. Then Kale began to read. Tomas, age 6, asked why every single day until there was no one left to ask. His voice didn't waver. He had promised himself 32 years ago that it never would, and it didn't now, though something behind his eyes had gone very far away, the look of a man reciting a vow he'd made to people who couldn't hear him keep it. Amara, age 14, wanted to be a pilot, kept a drawing of the ship folded in her pocket so she'd remember what it felt like the first time she saw stars up close. D. Hyan, age 9, left his shoes untied on purpose because his older sister always tied them for him, and he liked that she still did. The names went on. Kale didn't rush them, and he didn't slow for effect either. He read the way he read casualty lists, plainly, the same voice for everyone, because grief that played favorites wasn't grief at all, it was performance, and he had not come here to perform. By the 200th name, the Thessaline elder presiding had stopped shifting in his seat. By the 300th, even the translation drones had gone motionless, hovering silent above the delegations, as if they, too, understood there was nothing here that needed translating. He finished on the 431st name, and let the silence hold a second time, shorter now, a held breath rather than a held gravity. Then, from the raised observation seat that had stood empty for 60 years, the Myrai elder rose. It moved the way old rivers move, unhurried, certain of the shape it was going to take before it took it. Every head in the chamber turned. Even save Amarant, presiding officer of 2 centuries of sessions, had never once had to call this seat to order. The Myrai Collective has watched this chamber for longer than this chamber has existed, the elder said, and its voice carried the low resonance of something spoken from very deep in a very old chest. We do not speak often. We have found that most things do not require it. It paused, not for effect. The way something pauses when the next words have been sitting ready for a long time and are only now being allowed out. This requires it. The Mirai Collective formally recognizes humanity's right to full military response. The chamber didn't erupt. It didn't need to. What moved through those tiered seats instead was quieter and more final than applause. 219 delegations arriving in the same silent instant at the same understanding that whatever came next, no one here was going to stand in front of it. Preth Veldara felt the room turn away from her people before a single soldier had moved. High Commander Keth Varan watched the feed from the Cinder Rort, and his left manipulator, which had been rotating without pause since the mobilization began, went suddenly and completely still. He had spent 847 engagements believing every species could be pushed, provoked, and eventually managed back down to a negotiating table. He understood now, watching 431 names land on a chamber that had never once in 200 years agreed on anything unanimously, that he had been wrong about the shape grief took in this particular species. It didn't burn out. It didn't fade with the news cycle or cool with time the way every threat model in Velkath doctrine assumed it would. It had been given a direction and 91 warships, and it was not going to stop being that shape until it was finished. Kale delivered the ultimatum himself, standing at the same podium, the drawings still glowing on the wall behind him. He gave the Velkath Dominion 1 hour to surrender the officers responsible, cede the corridor, and open every border system that had gone dark in the last day to full accord inspection. He did not raise his voice for that either. Aboard the Cinder Rort, Varan watched the countdown with his manipulator finally, mercifully still. Around him, half his command staff had already begun quietly transmitting resignation notices to Dominion High Command, the kind of paperwork filed by people who wanted a clean record when the history of this got written. With 2 seconds left on the clock, the Velkath Dominion surrendered. No shots were fired. No hull was breached. 91 warships simply held their position, exactly where they'd been holding it for 3 days, while beneath them the Velkathari corridor's border defenses powered down, one grid at a time, like a held breath finally let go. Preth Veldara was arrested at her office 2 hours later, tea long since gone cold on her desk, the encrypted confirmation message still sitting unopened in an evidence file that would outlive her career, her rank, and eventually her name in any register that mattered. Varan was not arrested. There was no charge that fit a man who had only ever followed orders precisely as they'd been given. Instead, Dominion High Command quietly reassigned him to a border outpost so far from anything strategic that his own officers stopped returning his calls within a month. He spent the rest of his career explaining, to increasingly fewer people, that he had never understood what he was fighting until it was already over. Fleet Admiral Jonas Kale did not attend the formal surrender ceremony. He was back aboard the Sovereign Wrath by then, standing at the same window where he'd opened Oduya's file 3 days earlier, watching the corridor's lights come back on one system at a time. On his desk, beside the 7 crayon drawings his own children had made him over the years, sat a folder of physical printouts, not files. Paper. He'd had Oduya's photographs printed the moment they arrived, the old low way, ink on stock, the same instinct that had made him print the casualty report instead of just reading it off a screen. A digital file could be edited, buried, quietly reclassified by someone with the right clearance and the wrong intentions. Paper, once it existed, was simply a fact that had to be dealt with. It was why he still printed every casualty list. It had never once occurred to him, until now, that the habit was also a kind of armor. Lieutenant Commander Faye Oduya returned to the wreck of the Ardent Hope one final time, 3 weeks later, once the recovery teams had finished and the memorial engineers had begun their work. The shelter compartment had been left exactly as it was. Nobody had suggested otherwise. She stood in the doorway the way she had the first time. Then she walked in. She pressed her fingertips lightly to the wall, not touching the drawings, just near them. The way you stand near something precious without presuming to hold it. Priya's purple planet was still there, still slightly crooked. The ring of light drawn a little too thick on one side, where a small hand had pressed too hard with the crayon. They installed the beacon a month after that, a soft, low light fixed to the hull's exterior where the shelter compartment had been, powered to run for decades without maintenance. Nobody voted on a name for it. It simply became the children's lamp, the way things become names when enough people agree on them without ever discussing it out loud. And for a generation of Velkath navigators, charting the long way around the Velkathari corridor, it became the single most carefully avoided set of coordinates in their star charts. Not because it was dangerous,